We are going to be joined by Jules Boykoff and Callum McCloskey today, talking about the World Cup this summer coming up. We're going to start with Jules talking about kind of the sports washing and the macro political environment. And then Callum's going to talk a little bit about his recent research around kind of human rights strategy and how that's been implemented or otherwise in the case of the tournament. Sorry to give you a spoiler there for Callum. And then we'll have 20 minutes at the end where we'll have a bit of a conversation. There'll be opportunity to ask questions and a bit of discussion around the event coming up this summer. Okay, if you could make sure you're muted, that would be great. And then obviously if there's chance for questions at the end, we can jump in and have a conversation. And as we're going through, keep your eyes on, feel free to put questions in the chat and we'll come to those at the end as well. I think that's it from me. So I'll pass over to Jules for our first talk.
Okay, thanks very much, Adam. I really appreciate everybody being here today, and I look forward to Callum's presentation for sure and the conversation that ensues afterwards. So I'm going to talk about sports washing in the World Cup, so might as well start with a definition of sports washing that I work with, which is when political leaders use sports to appear important or legitimate on the world stage while stoking nationalism and deflecting attention from chronic social problems and human rights woes at home. Sportswashers use mega events to try to drum up national prestige and to rev up economic and political success. Sportswashing's #1 enabler and accomplice in the modern era when it comes to the World Cup is our guy, Gianni Infantino, right there in the middle, hanging out with President Putin, with whom he played football in the Kremlin, as well as you can see some other football stars there who also participated. Then he took up residence in Qatar in the lead into the 2022 World Cup, and where he oversaw measures and deflected attention from some of the human rights woes there. What I want to emphasize today, though, is my own home country, which is the United States, and what's happening there, and emphasize that sports washing can happen in both authoritarian and democratic spaces.
Okay.
The United States,
Veronica, please show it.
the United States today is changing. It's not a fully fledged democracy, according to scholars of democracy. In fact, it's what some people are calling the new competitive authoritarianism, not unlike what we saw with Viktor Orban for many years in Hungary. So it's definitely happening, I'm arguing in this talk today, sports washing in the United States. The second thing that I want to emphasize today is that sports washing can target a country's domestic population as much as a global audience. Take, for example, the Sochi 2014 Olympics that happened 4 years before Putin and company hosted the World Cup in 2018. After those Olympics, Putin's approval rating was extremely high. It was at 86% at that time. So he rode the success of the Sochi Olympics and turned around between the Olympics and Paralympics and invaded the Crimea. So it's not just a matter of, sports is creating space to avoid human rights. It's actually creating space for war sometimes as well. So I'll focus on how that all works in relation to the United States today. Sports washing is a pretty relatively recent term in the sense that it was coined in 2015 by some advocates around pushing back against the Baku Games in Azerbaijan, the European Games. The tenets of sports washing, some of its elements, stretch way back into history. When Athens and Sparta were at war, Athens entered a bunch of chariot racers to the Olympics and then did quite well. This young politician named Alcibiades took that momentum and turned around and tried to invade Sicily. More recently, much more recently, there was the 1934 World Cup under Benito Mussolini, where he treated the football players on the team as if they were this sort of fascistic new man. And they became what he called the soldiers of sport. And their success on the field, there they are on the field. They actually won the Il Duce Cup, the special cup that was 6 times bigger than the actual Jules Rimet trophy. And he turned around and used that power and engaged in bellicose international activity. 2 years later, Hitler's Olympics, the first one to host soccer at the Olympics. You can see the swastika in this photograph mixing right alongside the Olympic rings. They started the tradition of the Olympic torch relay there, which is a tradition that still continues through today. Well, the thing I want to highlight about this is the role that the media tend to play in sports washing. This is from the New York Times, a paper of record in my home country of the United States, where they wrote after the Olympics that, you can see it right there, Hitler is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, political leaders in the world today. So in that sense, when people ask whether sports washing works, often they mean that international audience. And if that's the barometer, then with the 1936 Olympics, the sports wash effort worked. Hitler was pretty ubiquitous there, and he made the most of it. Skimming forward to 1978, where you had a junta led by a guy named General Videla hosting the World Cup. This is a video I just want to play really quickly. See if you recognize somebody from world history, not just Videla here with his stylish mustache, but another person that should pop up. The audio is terrible on this, by the way. There he is. Okay, I did want you to hear that clamping at the end because it's the excitement of the event as Videla walks out to enjoy the match. You probably recognize the Henry Kissinger, the human rights ogre himself, was there, and he played a really important role in deflecting attention afterwards, saying the press was getting Argentina and this junta all wrong. So there's international audiences and there's domestic audiences, and sometimes, often with sports washing, I would argue that both are in play at the same time. Enter Donald Trump, who is a president of the United States who has used sports to his political advantage more than any other in the modern history of the country. We've got our guy Gianni Infantino, sports washing enabler #1, giving him the FIFA Peace Prize. We'll relive the moment in a minute here.
We want to unite. That's what we do here today. That's what we'll do at the World Cup, Mr. President. And you definitely deserve the first FIFA Peace Prize for your action, for what you have obtained in your way, but you obtained it in an incredible way. And you can always count, Mr. President, on my support, on the support of the entire football community or soccer community to help you make peace and make the world prosper all over the world. Thank you very much, Mr. President. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This is truly one of the great honors of my life.
So sports is really something that is valued by Trump. He used to own a USFL, an American football, U.S. American football team back in the day. And he's, as many will know here, he's hosting a UFC mixed martial arts event on the south lawn of the White House 3 days into the World Cup. So he has a long relationship with Infantino, going back to the bid process where Infantino was cozying up to him, giving him jerseys like that. That's Infantino in the back row of Trump's most recent inauguration in 2025. Infantino is holding up his camera, recording it, sitting in proximity to U.S. power, only a couple rows behind former U.S. presidents. So every chance Infantino gets, he brings a shiny gold item into the Oval Office. Here's one. Here's another, the FIFA Club World Cup trophy that he made a special replica for Donald Trump himself. Trump wouldn't evict himself when it came time to celebrating the winners, Chelsea, in that tournament. So there he is in the middle of it. Rumor has it he also pocketed a medal from that ceremony. Gianni Infantino even arrived late to a FIFA meeting because he was touring with Donald Trump. And he spent a lot of time in the Oval Office. And this is just one example where he is with U.S. soccer honcho Carlos Cordero.
Yellow card is a warning. Yeah. And when you want to kick out someone, it's very good. This could be useful. I don't know. I like that. That's for you. I like that. The next media session. Thank you.
The next media session, suggests Carlos Cordero. Great idea. He really needs a lot of suggestion to keep that pressure on the press. So anyways, Gianni Infantino had his camera out, as you could see at the back row of the inauguration. He basically posts every chance he gets on Instagram, his relationship with Trump. He really puts it out there, celebrates it. They seem to genuinely get along. He even hung out with his son, Eric Trump. And of course, there's Ronaldo alongside him as well. So just a few examples. So if I'm arguing that Trump is in fact part of a larger sports washing complex at work in the United States with this World Cup, what could he possibly be deflecting our attention from? Well, his net approval rating on the economy and his overall approval rating is lower than it has ever been during his two-term presidency. This was just a poll from a couple of days ago in the New York Times looking at his approval rating on a series of important issues, or at least important to a lot of voters: immigration, the economy, Israel, Palestine, the war in Iran. You can see he's just way underwater here in these polls. Of course, he might like to also deflect our attention from his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. As you'll know, his name appears in the Epstein files more than 1,000 times. Then there's the inflation that he said he was going to take care of on day one, and he obviously has not done that. There's the ongoing war alongside Israel and Iran, and that's not only racking up a big price tag, but it's also not achieving the goals that he has set out for himself and the country. And that is being reflected as well. This is a specific poll about Iran. You can see that it is a very unpopular excursion that he's involved with. But sports washing is not just in the purview of Republicans. Democrats that play a significant role as well. You can see U.S. former President Joe Biden alongside John Kerry there. Back in 2024, President Biden issued a national special security event designation. This is a special designation that gives extraordinary power to numerous intelligence bodies at the federal level and security bodies. And it is in effect starting in 2024 in Los Angeles already. So it's already in effect, and it'll be in effect through the end of the Olympics in 2028. There's also a different national special security event in effect for the World Cup final in New Jersey. So when you saw the U.S. ground troops on the turf in L.A. doing immigration and customs enforcement, some garish operations in MacArthur Park, for example, that could have possibly been related to the status of the national special security event, or it could have just been Trump sending them there separately. But he has the authority under this order from Biden to do things like that. I think it's worth pausing for a second to just sort of say, okay, we're talking about sports washing, we're talking about sports, but this has serious real effects. And a lot of people, including myself, are concerned that immigration and customs enforcement might be given free rein at the World Cup. We haven't heard anything to the contrary yet. So let's pause and think about who's actually being affected by this. In the United States right now, Trump immigration officials have been getting U.S. citizens snapped up. You'll know that 2 are actually killed by ICE in the streets of Minneapolis. Native Americans, I just wanted to pause for a second, like the levels of irony involved in snapping up Native Americans by immigration and customs enforcement and detaining them for long periods of time should be stated and should be not forgotten. One of the members of the U.S. Supreme Court had said recently that the administration has all but declared that all Latinos, U.S. citizens or not, are fair game to be seized at any time. And that is Justice Sonia Sotomayor and her colleague, Justice Kavanaugh, essentially gave birth to ICE to arrest people based on their accents, based on their appearance, based on their race. Not a great time to be hosting the World Cup and hosting tourists from around the world. Add to that the world is waking up to the fact that the United States has been added to a global human rights watch list. I actually think this is encouraging that the United States is being viewed more and more through a human rights lens. President Trump himself has not exactly been getting people's confidence up. Here's a recent interview he did around Meet the Press.
Your Secretary of State says everyone who's here, citizens and non-citizens, deserve due process. Do you agree, Mr. President?
I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know.
Don't you need to uphold the Constitution of the United States as
I
president?
don't know. I have to respond by saying again, I have brilliant lawyers that work for me.
Brilliant lawyers. So then I just wanted to point out a few other things related to ICE. You know, they have spyware now that they appear to be using. Phone searches at the U.S. border have hit a record high. I'm joining you from Sarajevo right now. I've been speaking with numerous journalists across Europe who have been telling me that they've been alarmed at the amount of personal information that they've been having to hand over to the U.S. federal government in order to secure a visa just to be a journalist at these games. We've got J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, cracking jokes, which I'll share with you in a second. He's going to refer at the end to the former Department of Homeland Security head, Kristi Noem.
I know we'll have visitors probably from close to 100 countries. We want them to come. We want them to celebrate. We want them to watch the game. But when the time is up, they'll have to go home. Otherwise, they'll have to talk to Secretary Noem, who I'll turn it over to now.
Hardy har. So it's like kind of a joke, you know, detaining people who are here as tourists. Recently, now you're looking at the current Department of Homeland Security secretary. His name is Mark Wayne Mullen, and he had a somewhat contentious discussion with a journalist on CBS as to whether he would be performing mass raids at the World Cup matches. Here's what he had to say.
So we find a felon, we find someone doing customs. Find a criminal, you will arrest them. But the mission at the World Cup is not immigration enforcement. We're not there. Well, ICE always says immigration enforcement. We're always going to do that. But we're not there for solely that purpose. We're in there to do our job. Immigration, custom enforcement.
So again, not willing to say that they won't be talking to tourists, checking their immigration papers, and so on. So that's the situation we find ourselves in, just less than a month before the opening of the World Cup. The thing about sports washing is that it's a gamble. It's not a sure thing. If you look back at the example that I gave before of 1978 in Argentina, actually there was some space that was opened at that time for political dissent. Don't get me wrong, the junta was crushing dissent, actually killing, torturing, and jailing leftists, some of them located only 700 meters from the stadium where Argentina won the World Cup 3-1 over the Netherlands. So it was happening before and it happened after, but during the World Cup, there sometimes is this period where dissent can be expressed without as much penalty. So in Argentina, Las Madres de la Plaza de Mayo had freer reign at that moment, and the international press was definitely interested in what they had to say. In the United States, there's this burgeoning network called the Anti-Fascist Football Coalition, who puts out memes such as this one, No Justice, No Games, who is active connecting various host cities and activists in these host cities. And they say that they will be active during this World Cup, trying to make sure that Trump doesn't just get away with easy sports wash. So it's up in the air. Will we have just a selfie festival of happiness for Gianni Infantino and Trump, and everybody achieves their political and economic objectives in here? Everybody gets to hobnob, make new friends, cut new deals, and so on. Or, you know, maybe Gianni Infantino won't quite get what he wants and wompity womp, kick the corner out of bounds. It's an open question and one I am excited to speak with you all about today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you very much, Jules. Lots of interesting thoughts there. I'm sure everyone will agree. If you've got questions based on what Jules has talked about, do feel free to put them into the chat and we'll come to them a little bit later. But for now, we're going to move on to our second speaker, Callum McCloskey from the University of West of Scotland, one of our own. As Jules said, the US has recently been added to human rights watch lists. But actually, this was a tournament that promised a lot in terms of human rights. Human rights was embedded from the bidding stage in part of FIFA's statute. And Callum has been looking in his research at how that's been delivered. So over to you, Callum.
I'll just sort it here. Yeah. Yeah, see that okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, all good. Okay, cool. So hello everybody. Thanks for having me today, and thanks Jules for your presentation. Really enjoyed that there. So following on from Jules' sport washing angle, I'm going to look at the World Cup from a human rights angle, going back over the key details of my PhD thesis, which was entitled Sports Mega Events, Human Rights and Governance, a Case Study of the United 2026 FIFA Men's World Cup. And then along with Adam as well, David McGillivray and Gail McPherson, we also published an article as part of this in Soccer and Society. And you can see it there. There we go. Okay, so when we see the words FIFA World Cup, what comes to mind? Is it Shabalala's goal in the first game of the South Africa World Cup? Is it Messi winning it in 2022? But how often do we think human rights when we hear those words? So I think it's fair to say there's been a tumultuous history between sports mega events and human rights, and this kind of came to the fore with the issues around the Beijing 2008 Olympics. So each tournament in the past decade in terms of World Cups has made headlines for human rights violations. So we think of workers' rights issues in Qatar, we think of discrimination, anti-inclusion in terms of laws in Russia for the 2018 World Cup, housing, property and land rights. We think of the protests in Brazil, the issues in South Africa, with the start of the Slums Act and things like that. We've got the white elephants, where empty stadiums in areas that the event is happening in, and FIFA stipulations. So at the moment, we see more of a transactional relationship than a transformational one. They come in, they make the money, and then they get out. That's what we're seeing. Just some examples there in those photos. So you have some of the protests in Brazil. You can see the hashtag FIFA Go Home, and some of the protests about boycotting Qatar with the No World Cup in Qatar, workers' rights, the red card for FIFA photo we see there as well. So before discussing the 2026 tournament specifically, I think it's important to understand why human rights became such a central issue within FIFA governance in the first place. So there's a long and often difficult history between sports mega events and human rights concerns, but this major turning point came in 2014. So in June 2014, in the lead up to the Brazil World Cup, John Ruggie and Mary Robinson published an open letter asking FIFA to take human rights responsibilities far more seriously, particularly given the growing scrutiny around labour conditions and broader governance issues linked to the World Cup. At the same time, there was external pressure from advocacy groups such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and the likes of those, NGOs, trade unions and the international media. So this coincided as well with the corruption crisis within FIFA, so including the arrest of delegates linked to bribery, racketeering investigations, which significantly damaged the organisation's legitimacy and public credibility. And then there was the international outrage over workers' rights and labour conditions connected to Qatar. So collectively, excuse me, these pressures pushed FIFA into a position where reform became increasingly difficult to avoid. So in response, FIFA introduced a series of governance and human rights reforms that included the incorporation of human rights commitments into Article 3 of the statutes, the introduction of a human rights policy based on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and the creation of a dedicated human rights division as well. So why does the World Cup in 2026 matter so much from a research perspective? I would argue that the tournament represents a really important test case, and in many ways the tournament of firsts. It'll be the largest World Cup in history, 48 teams spread across 3 countries and 16 jurisdictions across Canada, the US and Mexico. And that scale and complexity creates significant governance challenges in itself. But what makes the tournament particularly important from a human rights perspective is that for the first time, bidding nations and host cities were required to submit formal human rights strategies as part of the hosting process. So alongside that, FIFA also created tournament-specific human rights governance structures linked directly to the World Cup in 26. So unlike previous tournaments, human rights commitments were embedded into the planning process from the outset, at least formally. And really, that's what my research explores. I investigate how these commitments are, or in some cases aren't, actually being implemented during the planning and delivery stages of the tournament. So ultimately, the World Cup in 2026 becomes a key test of whether FIFA's post-2014 reforms represent meaningful institutional change in practice, or whether they amount to better public relations and symbolic compliance under external pressure. So just very quickly, these were the aims and objectives of my PhD. So to investigate the extent to which human rights promises made as part of the successful World Cup bid have been enshrined in planning and delivery processes, and then the objectives to critically evaluate how human rights promises have been implemented and with what implications for the host nation and awarding body. To critically analyse governance arrangements around human rights at the level of the awarding body, and to investigate how stakeholder involvement in tournament organisation impacts upon planning and delivery of human rights objectives. Okay, so methodology-wise, the project adopts a case study design centred on the World Cup. The tournament provides a particularly useful case because it involves a highly fragmented transnational governance structure operating across multiple countries, multiple political systems and jurisdictions, as I said. And that makes it a unique setting for examining how institutionalization processes actually unfolded in practice. So firstly, we had document analysis looking at bid requirements, host city strategies and the like. And then I was lucky enough to go to Philadelphia, New York and New Jersey and Toronto as sort of host city visits and non-participant observation, undertaking informal interviews with stakeholders there as well, and site visits to the stadiums. This was followed up by semi-structured interviews with key stakeholders such as FIFA staff, host city officials, civil society organisations and human rights experts. And then all of this together captures this complexity, well, aims to capture anyway, the complexity of a fragmented governance field and enables analysis of both formal structures and lived practices. So just a few photos here of my time away. So you can see in the middle there, that's the stadium where we'll be hosting in Philadelphia. New York the same. The final will be in that stadium there in the MetLife, and then Toronto as well. Some good times were had there. Okay, so theoretical framework wise, it draws on institutional theory to understand the World Cup as a transnational governance field involving FIFA, host cities, governments, sponsors and civil society actors operating across multiple levels. So it was particularly useful for examining how global expectations and local realities intersect in shaping human rights governance around the tournament. A key focus within the study was legitimacy and isomorphism, particularly how FIFA responds to pressures for credibility and external validation through the adoption of human rights policies and governance structures. Concepts such as selective coupling, decoupling, institutional inertia helped explain why many of these reforms often remained more symbolic than operational in practice. And ultimately, the most important construct for the analysis was institutional logics. So especially the tensions between commercial, political and human rights priorities within FIFA governance as well. So while institutional theory helped explain legitimacy pressures and competing institutional logics within the World Cup operational structure, the findings also showed limitations in relying on institutional theory alone to explain how influence operated across multiple governance levels. So stakeholder theory therefore became important not only for identifying different stakeholder types and defining these, but also for understanding the relationships between stakeholders and how influence was negotiated relationally through coalitions, advocacy networks and political support structures. So together, these approaches enabled analysis of both the structural pressures shaping governance and the stakeholder dynamics influencing how human rights commitments were implemented across the World Cup. So that's the graphic there that I used as the theoretical framework. So a central part of this was the incorporation of the four interconnected governance levels. So you can see the macro, the meso, the micro, and the nano level. So that's from FIFA and transnational bodies through to host cities, local communities, and advocacy coalitions. It was particularly important because actors furthest removed from formal governance structures could still exert pressure upward through advocacy, protest, and coalition building. So those at the nano level, because those at the bottom or at the nano level are often most affected by SME activities, but often lack that voice. So this coalition building and getting involved with those higher up the structure can eventually produce institutional change through accretion and accommodation and alignment with the institutional logic of human rights. So the transnational and decentralized delivery of World Cup 26 made this multi-level approach especially relevant, as each host context operates within different legal, political, and institutional environments. So institutional change therefore appeared less as a major transformation and more as gradual accommodation and alignment occurring unevenly across governance levels and host contexts. So moving into the findings, one of the clearest themes at the FIFA level concerned what institutional theorists would describe as competing institutional logics. So although FIFA now formally recognises human rights within its statutes and governance structures, interviewees consistently suggested that commercial and risk management priorities still dominate organisational decision making. So human rights were often framed less as a core organisational value and more as a form of liability management, something that becomes prioritised when it poses reputational, legal, or commercial risk. And while rights-based language has clearly become more visible institutionally, many respondents felt that the human rights teams themselves lacked sufficient authority or influence within wider governance hierarchies. So one interviewee described the reforms as absolutely optics, while another reflected on how top-heavy the organisation remains, where decision-making bottlenecks at executive level slow down or constrain institutional change. Second major finding was that FIFA's human rights structures often appeared symbolic and fragmented in practice. Policies, statutes, and dedicated divisions certainly exist, and most of the respondents responded positively to the human rights teams they had worked with, but stakeholders repeatedly questioned whether these structures possess the resources, authority, or institutional status necessary to drive implementation effectively. So just in terms of the structure of human rights, this is where human rights fits at the committee or the strategic level at FIFA. So in accordance with the FIFA statutes, the latest version, and the FIFA governance regulations, the committee, the Governance Audit and Compliance Committee shall establish a review committee, a compensation subcommittee, and a human rights and social responsibility subcommittee, and you can see that circled there. So below this strategic structure, there are 13 divisions. One of these is the social responsibility and education division, where human rights comes in. So within that division, it has 3 departments. There's sustainability and environment, there's human rights and anti-discrimination, and then the third one is safeguarding and job protection. And this division can then work with the subcommittee in providing guidance to the council. So you can see there's multiple levels to get through to make any meaningful change. Okay, so a third major finding in terms of the FIFA level concerned organisational culture, leadership, dynamics, and institutional continuity within FIFA itself. So a number of interviewees described how a reform momentum was heavily shaped by leadership structures and informal patronage networks within the organisation. And this mattered because many stakeholders felt that human rights were still often viewed internally as an external pressure to be managed rather than a fully embedded organisational priority. And as a result, institutional culture continued to prioritise business continuity, commercial stability, and reputational management over deeper rights integration. So one interviewee captured this quite powerfully by describing how difficult it was to pursue meaningful human rights work within an organisational culture that ultimately constrained what was possible institutionally. And then we have another major theme of stakeholder and coalition pressure, which I'll talk a wee bit about later on as well. So I'll move forward. So this was the structure in terms of human rights at the World Cup itself. So there you have the FIFA Zurich headquarters in terms of human rights, anti-discrimination in that division I was talking about earlier on. So the idea was to have human rights staff within the 3 national offices, and also these officers are liaising with the local coalitions, so Dignity 2026, North American Coalition, Mexico Unido, and the Canadian Collective. So any ideas that they had in terms of implementing human rights across those nations, they would go to them. And then the idea was to have human rights staff within the host city committees or a human rights lead, and then below that they would have stakeholder councils, committees, or coalitions. But a lot of this has not transpired as planned. The human rights leads were brought in late or not at all in many cities as well. So This was planned structure, but it hasn't really transpired in practice. So in terms of the World Cup itself and host city level, one of the clearest findings was the extent of governance fragmentation across the tournament. So the World Cup operates across 3 national legal systems, each with different human rights protections, legal traditions, and levels of ratification around international conventions. So at the same time, host cities are expected to take significant responsibility for delivery and implementation, but often without equivalent financial resources, institutional support, or clear enforcement mechanisms from FIFA itself. And this creates considerable ambiguity around accountability. So maybe between municipal, state, provincial, and federal levels of government. So one interviewee summarized this tension quite bluntly by arguing that meaningful implementation is possible if resources are prioritized, but the human rights do not appear to represent a central priority for FIFA. And there's also a number of cross-cutting human rights risks. So we have likes of security and policing concerns, housing pressure, displacement risks, and affordability concerns, and gaps in accessibility, inclusion, and anti-discrimination protections across cities. So basically, there's a lack of a uniform approach. In terms of structural barriers, limited resourcing for human rights work, a lack of specialist expertise. So a lot of times they were bringing in staff who had a business or operations background, but for example, wouldn't know what the United Nations guiding principles on human rights are. So there are a few complaints on that level. Governmental influence and political priorities. So state and federal actors shape this decision making, sometimes restricting rights protections. And the likes of immigration, policing, housing, labour legislation are often outside the municipal control, and political will varies, producing uneven human rights commitment across cities. So, for example, the Canadian example of Toronto, their host city committee was run by the government, so they had the resources, they had the expertise there at the beginning, whereas some US cities are more private run, and those facilities in terms of human rights weren't in place and weren't a priority to be put in place early on in the delivery phase. Then in terms of coalition mobilisation and local stakeholder action, Dignity 2026 and other coalitions were raising labour, housing and community concerns, and these had 3 mechanisms of influence. So agenda setting, expertise provision and reputational pressure. So I'm going to go through a quick example of this coalition mobilisation and pressure. So the development of the FIFA World Cup 26 human rights framework was a key example of this. A number of coalitions such as Dignity 2026 and the Sporting Rights Alliance shaped early drafts of this framework by setting minimum standards so cities don't fall below the floor, as one respondent said. And in an earlier March 24 draft, it was initially meant to be out in June 24. There was reportedly much clearer language around issues on fair wages, discrimination and stakeholder engagement, but interviewees described significant pushback once this framework went above the human rights team, higher up FIFA's organisational hierarchy. Several respondents argued stronger standards and accountability mechanisms were substantially diluted prior to publication, with one stakeholder describing the final version as having been effectively gutted, with these key means and measures and measurable outputs. Another interviewee pointed to the very quiet release of the framework with very limited publicity or media attention, and that was I seen as symbolic of the organisation's broader priorities around the document. So this basically shows the limits of policy-making influence when commercial and risk-based logics override rights-based logics when they have the lack of power within the organisation. So in terms of that, leveraging powerful allies and stakeholder salience is important there too. So this slide develops the previous slide by pointing further by showing how coalitions were often most effective when they aligned themselves with actors FIFA could not easily ignore. So this was during the Biden administration as well, and stakeholders said that it was more helpful in terms of that, and they had a fear of Trump becoming president once again. And we've seen that with the drawbacks of the DEI initiatives and things like that. So At this stage anyway, in terms of pre-2024, this included organisations such as the AFL-CIO, the NAACP, and actors within the US State Department related to human rights and broader government structures. One interviewee put this very directly, arguing that FIFA ultimately responds when pressure creates reputational, political, or financial consequences, whether that involves governments, labour action, sponsors, or media scrutiny. And we saw this particularly around the backlash surrounding the July 2024 framework. So using these powerful allies, even though it was still weak in enforcement, they were able to put some requirements back in there. So influence grows when advocacy groups align with definitive stakeholders, amplifying pressure FIFA cannot ignore. So let's go past that. So in terms of bringing these findings together, I think one of the central conclusions from the research is that many of the ingredients required for meaningful human rights delivery, things like stakeholder engagement, specialist expertise, dedicated resources, and clear accountability, do not fit comfortably within FIFA's fragmented delivery model for FIFA World Cup 2026, or as I've kind of put it there, the keys don't fit the locks. And unlike previous World Cups, there is no single local organising structure overseeing implementation across the tournament. Instead, responsibility is dispersed across multiple host city committees, operating within different political systems, legal frameworks, and governance environments. And the risk there is that important issues, whether linked to policing, displacement, labour protections, or inclusion, can effectively fall through the cracks between jurisdictions and levels of governance. And at the heart of this is a broader tension between corporate imperatives and rights-based governance. So although FIFA has clearly adopted the language and structures of human rights reform, the research suggests that commercial and business logic still dominate institutional decision-making. This limits the influence of rights-based actors, including local stakeholders and even FIFA's own human rights staff, who often lack sufficient institutional power to shape outcomes meaningfully. So while reforms have undoubtedly occurred, many appear reactive and heavily shaped by external pressure from advocacy groups, sponsors, civil society, coalitions, and reputational scrutiny. So a final few takeaways from the research. Firstly, policy is not the same as practice. And I think this links closely to Ahmed's idea of doing the document versus doing the doing, where organizations may adopt policies or frameworks, but translating those commitments meaningfully into practice is a much more difficult process. And ultimately, that's really what the findings around the World Cup in 2026 point towards. Human rights are now clearly appear within FIFA statutes, governance structures, but despite that progress, human rights have not yet gained sufficient institutional status or influence within the organisation to consistently drive meaningful operational change. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion. Cheers.
Thank you, Callum. So if you've got questions, do feel free to put them in the chat. You can also use the raise hand function, and I'll call on you when it comes to your turn. Please do bear in mind that the session is being recorded, so if you do want to come in and ask a question, just bear that in mind. I'll start with the question that Stephen Crossley put in the chat. I think this is for Jules, while everyone else is typing their questions for Callum. Given Iran's participation in the World Cup, Trump suggesting their safety can't be guaranteed, the threats to take host city status away from democratic cities, potential presence of ICE at World Cup venues, is there not an argument that the tournament's being used to augment and enhance Trump's authoritarian approach, both at home and abroad, rather than deflect attention away from it? So does it fit the definition of sportswashing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really appreciate that. I'm looking at it now here in the chat. Well, I guess I would start by just saying that us here in this meeting room might think, when we see that list of things you mentioned there all in play, that we might think authoritarian, but many people might think strongman, and Trump supporters might think strongman, and Trump might like the term strongman, and strongman could be a benefit for the upcoming elections in November in the United States. Second, I would say that, yeah, I mean, I want to make sure I'm being clear that these mega events absolutely augment and enhance authoritarianism, whether it's Trump or anybody. I mean, just to sort of scope back for a second, sports mega events like the Olympics and World Cup are essentially for local and national police forces like their own private cash machine. They can get all the special weapons and laws they'd never be able to get during normal political times. Those special weapons aren't put back in the box and returned to sender afterwards. Those special laws are very rarely rescinded afterwards or sunset afterwards. They become part of normalized policing in the wake of the games. And in countries like the United States, we should say normalized racialized policing in the wake of the games. And so that's kind of par for the mega event course. And so yes, I do think this event could be used to enhance Trump's authoritarian approach, but that doesn't mean that that it's not sports washing at the same time. Take Exhibit C, I guess, if I'm going down my list here, like Vladimir Putin when he hosted the 2018 World Cup, and the Olympics before that. I mean, he, along with the Russian Duma, in the case of one law, passed like a very anti-LGBTQ law that was some athletes in Sochi dissented against. Then ahead of the 2018 World Cup, he passed an edict, very authoritarian, that raised the eligibility rates for pensioners, or the age for pensioners. And so the idea was doing a very unpopular authoritarian thing right before the Olympics. Was he trying to deflect attention from his authoritarianism? No. Was he trying to show he was a strongman? Yes. They had a law during the Russian World Cup that you couldn't protest in host cities. So I see what you're saying, but I still think that if we take the basic definition of sports washing to be deflecting attention from chronic social problems and human rights woes, doesn't mean they're going to be deflected for everybody, while burnishing one's individual reputation, strongman, national reputation, hopefully, and setting up opportunities for political and economic advancement. I think the glove fits.
Yeah, great. So a question for Callum, but maybe I think it was for Callum, but I think maybe Jules, we might have thoughts on it as well. What challenges did you encounter in terms of the ethics of getting interviews with staff who work for FIFA and things like that?
Yeah, it was quite difficult overall, to be honest. I think it's more about who you know and what context they have. In terms of the FIFA staff, it was only really one or two main people I was able to interview, and they were the human rights level. So getting anything outside those in the human rights department was very, very difficult. So that was probably one of the drawbacks of the research, is that, but it's a finding in itself that people don't want to talk about it because of what is happening, in terms of how it's further down in terms of structure and has a lack of influence within FIFA as an organisation. So I think it's a finding in itself, but yeah, very difficult in getting access, I would say.
Yeah, and so just a question from Bakir, just thinking about how do we piggyback and hijack the World Cup 2026? I was going to piggyback on that and say, what can we as activists, academics and fans really do to address these issues of sports washing, but also these issues around the human rights impacts of the event? I don't know if Jules, do you want to start on that? You're muted at the moment, Jules.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And I appreciate you reading that paper, The Glitterati and Grit. Awesome. So yeah, I mean, this is an open question, as I tried to close my presentation by saying, like, this not just all dour and down. This is a chance because of the fact that the World Cup and other sporting mega events like it, they're so massive. They're such huge juggernauts. When they roll into your town, they roll over the toes of numerous activist groups. This is a chance for you to link arms with people who are like-minded. This is also a chance, I might say, to show the world that the United States can be, or Canada or Mexico can be, like, very welcoming places. The United States is not Donald Trump. Not everybody is a MAGA fan. And so, like, this is actually a chance to show a welcome mat to the world. But in terms of piggybacking and hijacking, I'm already hearing a lot of exciting things that are happening in various host cities. You know, I think most smart activists, savvy activists at this point aren't going to put all their cards on the table, but I definitely know that the Black Alliance for Peace are putting forth a number of they're linking together groups around the United States context. There's the No Olympics LA group in Los Angeles, who's been around since 2017 at least. And they have their own Jules Rimet trophy that my understanding is they're going to be spattering in blood and taking around to various protests. So, if you want to get involved, I would say support those groups and go and learn from them and share your knowledge with them. But I think this is an open question, the way this World Cup is going to happen. And it doesn't have to be some kind of victory for Donald Trump and Gianni Infantino.
Do you have anything on how we can deal with some of these challenges?
I think it's, I suppose, trying to get into mainstream media as much as possible. Like, we all know about the issues, some specialists know about the issues, but not enough people generally know about what's going on. In terms of general fans of the tournament or fans of football, they focus on that event aspect rather than behind the event. So I suppose it's finding channels and getting that into mainstream media. And there are groups doing that in terms of, like I mentioned, the Dignity 26 coalitions, the likes of Amnesty, Human Rights Watch. But again, I think it doesn't get into people's hands in terms of the fans and the general fan, I suppose, I would say.
Yeah, great. And a great question here from Glenn, just talking about the carbon neutral statements that FIFA made around the Qatar World Cup. Do we see a similar discourse around the World Cup in the United States, Mexico, and Canada, or has that fallen by the wayside? Human rights has become the new trending thing that they're giving the rhetoric and not actually doing anything on, or is that greenwashing still there?
Don't worry, greenwashing is alive and well at this World Cup. Absolutely. And in fact, okay, so if we back up to Qatar, it was obviously a joke, their idea. But what they can say of being a green, sustainable event, they're originally saying it was going to be carbon neutral, which you can't even really do ahead of an event. There were 1,300 flights a day going in and out of Qatar. There was even the grass seeds that were flown in to make the turf for the tournament were flown in on a climate-controlled jet from North America. The climate, just everything was a joke about that. But unbelievably, it's even worse in terms of emissions for the United States. I focus on the United States. I just put in the chat an article or essay I just wrote that was published like 3 days ago in The Guardian that kind of breaks down the way I see it. I see this as El Greenwash Grande, basically. I mean, there's going to be 9.9 million tons of carbon. It's like the massive carbon sporty bomb that's going up for this, and that's a low-end estimate. The U.S. does not have a train system that's suitable for getting people around, so people are going to be flying from place to place just to get to the next match. Yeah, I mean, it's a real problem moving forward. And of course, we're worried about the athletes and the fans and even, I guess, a few referees, like they also are at danger. And that's where we are seeing some media coverage. I wouldn't say we've been seeing a ton about greenwashing, but in terms of fan safety. But look, I mean, FIFA, I call them the greed machine in the subtitle of my book because even they're giving water breaks now at these matches because heat induced from climate change. They're going to have 3-minute breaks every halfway through, where they're going to allow for commercials for 2 minutes and 10 seconds. So they're actually kind of benefiting in a strange way commercially from the climate. So I think there's a lot out there that we really need to get our hands around. And I think there's a lot of people in North America that still care about the climate. So this is something I wish more people are talking about.
Right. I think a really interesting question here from Salma. I'm going to read it out in full. A PhD researcher working on sportswashing and territorial attractiveness in the Moroccan context, and their research is funded by a Moroccan public scholarship organisation. As early career researchers, especially when working on politically sensitive topics linked to our own countries and institutions, how can we conduct critical and rigorous work on sportswashing without fear of professional, institutional, or personal backlash? And how do you personally navigate the emotional and ethical dimensions of researching power, authoritarianism, and sport? Either of you want to jump in first on that? Yeah, Jules, you're muted at the moment.
Maybe Callum, since you were more recently in that situation, you might have thoughts on how to negotiate what they're nicely laying out.
I suppose for me, as a football fan and a World Cup fan, it was difficult for me at the beginning to kind of separate my personal love for the game. I'm a professional, you know, lust to find out what's going on and what are the problems associated with it. So for me, it was negotiating that firstly. Yeah, I suppose sometimes the only way to make something better is to tear it down and start again. So obviously I don't want that to happen to the World Cup, but you know, it has to go through significant criticism perhaps to ignite that change. Because we've seen in the research there that, you know, a lot of the times it's due to public pressure and legitimacy sort of questioning that they do make an attempt to change. So I think it's that you have to just accept it to build something up. Sometimes you have to tear it down in the first place, I would say.
Jules, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I mean, I think caution is due. I think positionality matters a lot. Here I am, a middle-aged cis white guy. I have like certain benefits in my column that allow maybe to be a little bit more obstreperous on things. And don't worry, I'm not going to waste the opportunity. But like everyone has to kind of figure out where they're at in their life, their career, their positionality, and think strategically about just in the way that I think is implicit in the question in terms of how you put yourself out there. And, you know, the other thing is, you know, the PhD is really, really important. It's, and I don't want to diminish the intellectual value of a PhD by any means, but in a way, it's also kind of, it's like a welding card, you know, if you want to be a welder, you need to have a welding card that shows you know how to weld. And it's kind of like that. And you don't have to, you want to learn how to be a welder while you're there. And then once you're done and you get out into the world and you're a welder, you can make all sorts of art out there. So I guess that would be, I'd urge a little caution, but also make sure you always remain who you are.
Yeah, that's great. I think that brings us to a close. I thought I share from Miriam in the chat here. As long as we're discussing and respecting human rights in the political system, there's people out there that don't even know what human rights means. And so it is really good to keep having these conversations, even if it feels like at a certain point we've been banging the drum that these are issues at sport mega events for a very long time. So I want to thank both of our speakers, Jules and Callum. There's some links in the chat to some of their recent work you can look at if you're interested. All of these sessions are recorded and available online. This session will be up fairly soon, so you'll be able to find it. I'll post a link to where you can find it in the chat just now. And all that remains is to thank you for coming along, asking good questions and having a good conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you.